Good day, everyone, and welcome to We Talks, brought to you by the World Energy Council. I'm Arthur Hanna. So I'm delighted to welcome for this edition of We Talks, Betty Sue Flowers. Welcome, Betty. Now, Betty is a prolific writer, editor, and international business consultant, and has a wide and varied career experiences, which includes, interestingly for me at least, years as editor for Shell's Global Scenarios. Welcome, Betty Sue, and welcome to We Talks.
Thank you, Arthur. Thank you very much.
Now, part of the, hope for the World Energy Council is that we talk about energy transition within the industry. The World Energy Council talks about energy transition, and last year introduced the concept of humanizing energy in the context of that transition. And what it seeks to do, I hope, by these conversations is to open up the dialogue, not to be just a dialogue, if I can call it, of the great and the good within the industry, but it open up to influencers as well, individuals that have been part of or have witnessed that energy transition and have a point of view on it. But one of the things, obviously, that reading a little bit about you and also our conversations is you have a view with regard to the importance of storytelling in the context of a vision of direction. And that vision could be for a corporate, could be for a government, or presumably it can be for an individual as well. So to set the scene, it would be really interesting to get your position with regard to storytelling, its importance. And I think one of the things we talked a little bit about, some examples of where you think stories have been well told and have influenced actually the future that we move towards. So Betty Sue, it'd be interesting to get your perspectives.
Well, I'm particularly interested in stories about the future because I think the present, what we do in the present, is shaped by the stories we tell about the future. If I said, for example, there's going to be a fire drill in 3 minutes, you might be looking around to see your things, how to, where's the exit? If I say we're going to have ice cream in 3 minutes, you're in a different mood altogether. So the story we tell about the future and what's possible in the future shapes the present. But here's the important thing about stories about the future. They're always and only a fiction. The future doesn't exist. So any story we tell about the future is made up. That means we can make up better stories about the future. And scenarios are a particular way of doing that. Scenarios come in sets of 2, 3, or 4 usually. And they're alternate stories of the future, and they have to be plausible because you won't live into a story of the future if you don't think it's plausible, not only possible, but plausible. So part of the energy transition work, it seems to me, is to dwell in the stories of the future where energy has been humanized.
Yes.
To an extent that it seems both possible and plausible. We see how it can be done. Energy transition is possible, but we have to dwell in that story of the future to actually make it happen.
I find that hugely important. When you said that there's that really resonated. Who do you think has told good story? I mean, give me some example, give the audience some examples of good storytelling in terms of the impact it's had, and also, I suppose, impact in terms of creating a future that was very similar to the story that was told.
Well, I think the job of a leader is to tell the story of the future. That's the main job of a leader. And then to gather the energies of the people with him or her to move into the future. So, for example, Martin Luther King said, "I have a dream," and that galvanized a whole movement. Moses, I see the promised land. Leaders, really good leaders, tell all kinds of stories around the main story that actually galvanize people because no one can remember instructions, nor does anyone want to follow instructions. But you follow the story of what you think the good is.
I recognize that notion that you need to galvanize individuals. It's not about you necessarily, but it's the galvanizing your populace, your stakeholders, your shareholders to move in the direction that you seek them to move for the betterment of society, for the betterment of moving legislation forward, or whatever the agenda might be for the future. So I think that's important as well. I suspect from what you're saying.
Yes, and these stories galvanize the people to be leaders themselves in their own bailiwick.
Yes.
Because if I'm somewhere on the assembly line and we have this image of what we're trying to produce, and I believe in that. I believe in that ideal. I might come up with a better way to do things myself that the boss would never have known about. So it's really important to galvanize everyone by the story of what we're up to, the story of what we desire. And so the best stories for leadership are inspiring ones, and certainly not ones around loyalty to the leader. Those can be very powerful, but they have a relatively short shelf life.
And I'm interested, I think that, the transition now to, humanizing energy in the context of the transition. I think I was struck by a point, which is that it can galvanize individuals to be leaders themselves. It can be the individual as well that needs to take leadership to make us go on that transition as well. We can't just delegate the journey to the great and the good. We need to individually take some responsibility for that and understand them. So that kind of leads into my own, as we talked about when we chatted last week. I mean, humanizing energy is one of those phrases that can be interpreted differently by different audiences. How do you interpret humanizing energy transition? How has been your own takeaway from those words, and what does that galvanize in your own mind in terms of thinking about the way in which we need to respond to that agenda?
Well, I think in the past, energy is sort of seen as a commodity. You sell it at a price that you hope is a high one if you're the producer, and it's like shoes and anything else, it's a commodity. But especially in this age in which we're also interconnected through energy, now we see it as something else. It's almost a river of life, like water or air. Mm-hmm. It's always been important, but now we see it as almost what interconnects us as human beings, and it's occupying a different place on the stage. It turns out to be very important for enabling us to make the next step in our journey of humanity. It's also key to saving the earth. So, from any direction, it has assumed a kind of importance in as I say, the story of humanity that it's never had before, I think. It's up in the minds of people who are not in the energy business. So people in the energy business who used to mind their own business, so to speak, now have to mind the business of the world. And that puts the energy leaders in a different place. So humanizing energy is both an ideal, but it's also already a reality.
Yes.
Because human beings around the world are now, they have energy. The story of energy, some story of energy, is in their minds in a way that it never was before. And I've seen this in my over 25 years as an outside observer coming into the energy business, and different ones, not just Shell. I've seen this develop over the last 25 years.
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think it's a really good moment for us to think about the way in which individuals can interpret what it means to them in the context of the transition, but the importance of it as well. But also, as you rightly say, for leaders in energy to recognize, I love your phrase, river of life, that energy provides, as it does do in terms of the way in which we think about it and the way in which we live our lives today. So I think basically getting your mind around that, I think, is very important if you are a leader within energy, but also all of us listening or participating, we all have a part to play, I think, in that humanizing energy as well. This goes back to your early point with regard to stories, is that it can galvanize individuals to take their own leadership actions with regard to the transition that we need to make over the course of the next number of years. I think that's very important. Now, you mentioned,
what else
yeah,
is
sorry,
important, Patrick, that I just want to put in here because I think it's extremely important, is that the public that cares about the environment sometimes tells a story that doesn't work. They tell a black-white story, a good and evil story.
yes,
Fossil fuels evil, and without understanding that we have to have a transition, that it's not about fighting evil with good. This is not the journey we're on, that it is a transition. So energy leaders really have to tell the story very clearly, very often, that humanizing energy involves a transition, and also to be shown as traveling along the path on that transition, and not, it's a very tricky moment in terms of these two stories that are operating. So I think it behooves the energy leaders to step up and tell this humanizing energy story in order to educate and replace a kind of story of concerned people that they hold now, which is a bad, good story.
No, I couldn't agree more. I think I often personally go on about the polarization of the energy debate in that manner. Oil and gas bad, as you say, renewables good, let's say, or the other way around, depending on which platform. And the fact of the matter is, we have to come to a consensus about how we compromise on both to move forward and embrace and make sacrifice on both so that we can move forward. Otherwise, I think we're going to be polarized into positions that will be disastrous for humankind as we go forward.
Yes, but the other aspect of humanizing energy is energy for everyone in the world, which means a growth in energy. So we have to manage meeting the aspirations of developing countries and people around the world at the same time that we have to save the planet. So that's a more nuanced story than just getting rid of fossil fuels, like some people tell the story that way.
Time is running on, and we want to kind of bring the conversation to a close. So a couple of things that we talked about, and you mentioned a little bit, scenarios and how they could be used in the context of storytelling. So if you don't mind, both of us, you far more expert than myself, but I have used scenarios many times in my career, and I found them very helpful. Why are they important, and what do they do that other forms of stories don't do? Maybe a little bit on that, and then we'll come to a close.
There's several things they do. One is that in creating them, you shake up the official future, because we all walk around, whether we're conscious of it or not, with a story of what the future is going to be. And leaders of organizations have that story more strongly than almost anyone else. They have to, because they're living into the future. But scenarios come in sets of different futures. So you have to be flexibly oriented towards the future when you think of your strategy within a scenario story, because they're different futures that your strategy has to be robust in. The other thing, scenario building requires people to come up with all kinds of different points of view without arguing about, does my point of view win over your point of view?
Yes.
So scenarios are a platform for strategic conversation that isn't a fight, but it's actually an exploration, because it's a fiction. So, nobody's going to fall on their sword over a fiction, but still it unearths strategic thinking that may not have been unearthed otherwise. Okay,
well, I think we're, in theory, we're at the end of our allotted time. Let's just some of the words I wrote down. One was plausible with regard to stories. I think that's really, because you can have the word story and your mind could go somewhere, but plausible stories perhaps grounds me, and I felt your comments on that were really useful. The role of leadership your point about leadership by definition is perhaps already in the future, because that's why it's there. It's there to take people, take organizations, take institutions or society to a different place. So by definition, it needs to be good at telling what that narrative needs to be, or that story. Galvanize, you used as a word. I felt that's important. But I liked your point about galvanizing individuals for their own leadership position as well. I think galvanize can be, we believe it, or and we'll move in a certain direction. But I always like this notion of individuals taking their own responsibility for actually driving things forward. And if a story can help you do that, then I think that will be great. Scenarios in that context that we talked about, scenarios as an excellent way of telling stories, but recognizing that the way in which energy transition perhaps is framed today, it's polarized. It's polarized in terms of one side good, one side bad, vice versa, depending where you stand. And the reality is we do have different scenarios with different contexts, that we'd all be wiser, perhaps, if we allowed ourselves to unbias ourselves and listen to those scenarios as we go forward. I think you mentioned that. And I think your point about humanizing energy is that it's the reality of where we are, but also there is the challenge of more energy that will be needed for the globe over the course of the next 20 years. It's not about less energy, and it's those choices that we'll make around bringing that energy to individuals that I like that kind of final image in my mind, if you will, the river of life that energy is, and therefore the relevance of humanization associated with that. So Betty Sue, they were my kind of quick thoughts that I had from our conversation. Any closing thoughts or comments I will around the importance of storytelling for our audience?
No, I think it's important to be conscious of the story you're telling, and to think about how you could tell a better story. Human beings often tend to tell a victim story. And if you notice that, where does the action originate? You can turn it into a hero story just by changing the source of action. And every person is a hero in their own life, in that they are the source of action, or can be, in their own story. And that goes for corporations too. So we all are living into a story that we hold of the future, and we should tell a better story.
Very good. Well, Betty Sue, thank you so much for your time today. As always, a fascinating discussion. It's probably something we could have continued for a much longer period of time. So thank you for that. And thank you to everyone dialing in, tuning in, or listening to this later. I hope all of you have found it interesting in the context of the importance of storytelling as we talk about energy transition and humanizing energy. This, as I mentioned at the start, is one of many We Talks. I have down here that the website that you need to go onto is www.worldenergy.org/We Talks, all one word. Please go on that link and either listen to other We Talks or participate in the overall debate and discussion with regard to humanizing energy, hosted by the World Energy Council. To everyone, and to Betty Sue, many thanks.